A lot of people want to make the argument that the reason that gun mortality is so high in red states is because of their blue cities. They claim that those blue cities are apocalyptic wastelands full of crime and chaos. And look, I get it. That narrative makes sense on the surface because more people, obviously more crime. But that argument falls completely apart when we consider that the states with the lowest rates of gun mortality are blue states with their blue cities. This is a consistent finding. It has been shown since the year 2000 over and over and over. The states with the strictest gun laws, which are typically blue states, have the lowest rates of gun mortality. Yet this argument persists. And it is screamed loudly by pro-gun groups and politicians on the right. The only reason that states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana have such high gun mortality is because of those liberal blue cities. Following the tragic events in Uvalde, Texas, where 21 lives were lost, Texas Governor Greg Abbott said it could have been worse, and he pointed to cities like Chicago, New York, and LA as proof that gun control does not work, while conveniently ignoring that Texas's gun mortality rate is significantly higher than Illinois, twice as high as California, and about 4 times as high as New York. I know what you're saying. Dr. Dowd-Arrow, are there any studies to back this up beyond what the FBI publishes on the Uniform Crime Report or what the CDC puts out? Well, in a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Surgery last year, they found that gun mortality was more likely to happen in small rural areas than in large major urban cities. In another study, also published last year, researchers wanted to see whether gun mortality was higher in conservative or liberal areas. In order to determine whether it was the blue states with their blue cities driving gun mortality, researchers organized areas of the country by who they voted for in the 2020 election. In other words, they wanted to know if the areas that voted for Joe Biden had higher rates of gun mortality than those areas that voted for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. That over the course of the study period, gun mortality was 23% higher in the states that voted for Donald Trump than it was in those areas that had voted for Joe Biden. They also found that if you remove large cities from those red states, the numbers in the red states got worse. Even when we remove the large cities from those red states are 12% higher in gun mortality than the blue states with their blue cities still included in the data. Okay, sure, Dr. Dowd-Arrow. Maybe the overall trend is that blue states with blue cities are much better than red states, right? But what about those cities that Greg Abbott mentioned? What about Chicago, LA, and New York? Well, let's look at a few things. And what better place to start than the land of Lincoln? After all, everyone wants to scream Chicago, Chicago, Chicago whenever conversations of gun violence come up. Chicago has a gun homicide rate of 19.7 per 100,000, which seems high until we consider the gun homicide rate of cities in states that have looser laws. For example, the gun homicide rate in St. Louis, Missouri is 66.7 per 100,000, and the gun homicide rate in Birmingham, Alabama is 61.3 per 100,000. And while Mississippi doesn't really have any large cities, their largest city is Jackson with about 150,000 people, and they have a rate of 64.7 per 100,000, which is significantly higher than Chicago. Greg Abbott also mentioned Los Angeles and New York, so let's look at those two cities. Los Angeles has a gun homicide rate of 7.7 per 100,000, making it the safest place I've mentioned so far. Well, at least until we bring the city into it. New York City has a gun homicide rate of 3.1 per 100,000. But Dr. Dowd-Arrow, let's look at the state of Florida, since that's where you're from, and let's look at those liberal cities and rural areas there to see how they match up with the rest of the country and the rest of the data. So let's start with Tampa, Florida. Tampa has a gun homicide rate of 11.3 per 100,000. Which is better than Chicago. But let's keep going. Let's look at Tallahassee and Miami. Tallahassee, Florida has a gun homicide rate of 4.1 per 100,000, which makes it tied with the gun homicide rate in Miami, Florida. Okay, Dr. Dowd-Arrow, that's what some of the liberal cities look like in Florida. What about some of those rural red areas? Well, to understand that, we're going to go over to Ocala, Florida, a city with a population of about 65,000 people. Ocala, Florida has a gun homicide rate of 28.9 per 100,000, making it one of the most dangerous cities in America. But why is Chicago, Illinois so high on the list? Remember, they had a rate of 19.7 per 100,000, which made it higher than all of the other blue cities that I listed, including Tampa, Florida. Why is it that they are so much higher when they are in a state with much stricter laws? Well, to understand that, we need to think about the role that the weaker gun laws of the states surrounding Illinois play in arms trafficking. A large percentage of the guns recovered from crime in Chicago were actually purchased in surrounding states and trafficked into the city. Those guns are purchased legally in states like Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and then used in crimes in Chicago. The lax gun laws that allow criminals to purchase guns legally in other states make Chicago more dangerous than it otherwise would be. So yeah, unlike what Greg Abbott claimed, it's not the large cities that are driving gun mortality. It's the smaller rural areas. And we know this because we have data so we can compare the two. And we also know that states with stricter laws have lower rates of gun mortality. Thoughts?